Okay, so thank you, Olivia, for that amazing slide. We will get started, and I will be introducing each of our four panelists today briefly. So starting with Casey, coming from Massachusetts. She's an assistant dean of students and director of residential services at University WPI. And next is Fatimata. She is originally from New York. She is currently a first-generation college student who attends Lafayette, majoring in government, law, and international affairs. Third is Sarah. She is coming from Massachusetts. She's an activist, entrepreneur, and public speaker who is also the founder and president of the diversity and inclusion consulting firm named after her. Lastly is Ina, coming from Massachusetts, studying economics at Harvard, and she's also currently pursuing a career in TV, film, and acting. Okay, time for the questions. We will first start with the first question, which is, can you introduce yourself? Casey, if you want to go first.
Sure. So my name is Casey Wall, as you've heard. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm really excited to be here today, and I want to thank Olivia and her peers for the invite. So as mentioned, I'm Assistant Dean of Students and Director of Residential Services at WPI. I also do a number of other things at WPI, including co-advise our Alliance, which is our LGBTQIAP+ student group. I'm one of the assistant softball coaches, and I also advise the Lego Club. I do a number of other things in my spare time, but those are all of my WPI related activities. So I'll leave it there for whoever's next.
I guess I can go next. My name is Fatimata, currently attend Lafayette College in Eastern PA, government law and international affairs major. I do a lot of organizing outside of school related to gender equity, combating issues related to Islamophobia. I founded Muslims Matter in 2019 to help combat that issue. I also run the Girl Up chapter at my college. So that's it.
Sarah, I think you are muted.
How about now? Can you guys hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah. I am from Boston, and I am the founder and president of Sarah Maker LLC that focuses on authentic inclusion. And then I also founded a nonprofit organization that focuses on disability inclusion. I went to Wellesley College for undergrad, and then I went to Harvard for my master's in public policy. And I'm passionate about inclusion across all different types of identities and voices and groups.
Hi, my name is Ina. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska, but I'm currently living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm 20 years old, and I have two nonprofits of my own. I founded Dream Equal, which is a gender equality nonprofit, which is dedicated to empowering all people to realize their full potential regardless of gender. And we're unique because we take a different approach to solving gender equality. We focus on young people, specifically children, and tackling gender stereotypes at the age in which they develop. And I also founded One Up Action, which is a climate justice initiative, which is focused on giving marginalized youth the resources that they need to take action against the climate crisis in their own individual communities. And both of them just celebrated their first birthdays just like a month ago, and we're currently in 32 different countries.
Thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves. You guys are amazing. And now moving on for the second question, it's what does intersectional feminism mean to you? Why do you view it as important for feminism to be intersectional in their fight for gender equality?
I guess I can start. So I think that conversations surrounding gender equality, feminism, it's a very much a conversation that needs to be part of every single aspect and identity that's really relevant to our lives. For instance, from my perspective, I focus a lot on disability inclusion. And the conversation of disability cannot be had without talking about gender, the gender conversation, and vice versa. When we're talking about women issue and kind of bringing forward that voice and the perspective, we need to also be considering the disability conversation. So the gender narrative is embedded in every single part of our lives and our identities, whether it's talking about health issues, whether it's talking about race, gender, disability. And we are all people with multiple identities, and we need to make sure that feminism is part of every single kind of narrative that's out there.
I can piggyback on what Sarah just said. I think the other aspects that are important to recognize is that while identifying as a woman or female, that means very different things for everyone. And so often recognizing that feminism is going to show up differently in different spaces and being able to capture that in a way that's meaningful. And I think that also gets a lot into what Sarah was talking about the intersectionality of disability or race and other aspects, because that disability or race or whatever other identity we're talking about shows up very differently. And so you have to make space for that feminism conversation, but understanding that people present very differently and to not make assumptions when really getting into the discussion around feminism and gender specifically.
I really like what you said, Casey, about how feminism shows up differently for everyone. And I think that really brings out the reason of why we need to focus so much on intersectionality, because oftentimes we try to implement blanket solutions when we're thinking about women's rights or gender equality. We try to say like, oh, like we're just going to pass this law or we're going to have this policy, when in reality that policy probably usually affects only white cis women in a good way. And so when we really like just saying, you know, or like just saying that we think about everyone is not enough, we really have to make sure that like our solutions are tackling every single person differently. I always say like equality and equity, like whenever we are taught about it when we're like a kid and we're like, oh, treat everyone the same. That is really, really harmful, because equality and equity is not about treating everyone the same. Because the truth is we all start in different places because of the systematic oppression that so many of us face. And to actually see progress, we need to treat everyone differently so that everyone has an equal chance at getting to a good outcome. And so I think that's why intersectional feminism just means so much to me, because as someone who does lead like a feminist movement, I think, and someone who has been affected by feminism in so many like different ways, I think it's important to look at it in a very a way that's personal to everyone.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said in terms of like what intersectional feminism means. I think for me in particular, it's about acknowledging the privileges and how the country or like place that you're living in functions, and how it structurally and systemically impacts, women differently across the board depending on their race, class, religion. And I think a lot of the times people like to, I guess, like what Ina said, go about it in a very umbrella way, where like we're passing legislation or we're putting up solutions that can only benefit one group of women. And I think for a long time, if we look at feminist history, for a long time, there was a lot of exclusion when it came to women of color in particular, or trans women, or non-binary people. So I think really thinking about how we go about these solutions, but also including groups of people that have been systemically excluded in the past. So that's what that means to me.
Those are amazing responses. I definitely agree with them, and they're very powerful. Now, moving on to our third question is, can you describe an experience where you were defined by your gender, race, sexuality, etc., and how did you handle it, and what did you learn from it? Sarah, if you would like to go first.
Sure, yes. An identity that I'm constantly identified with is by my disability. I am blind, and as a woman, that walks around with a white cane. I am a blind Muslim woman. So I have three labels, three identities that really are attached with certain assumptions. And when I travel the world with my work, or even when I'm in my own home state, there are certain narratives of who I am, whether that's, oh, you're a person with a disability, that means you probably never went to school, or you can't do certain things, or I feel bad for you, you have a tough life, etc. Or Islamophobia from, oh, you're not from this country, or even a lot of sexism kind of narrative. As a social entrepreneur, that founded her first organization when I was 20 years old. I've had to really fight a lot of these isms to really make sure that I am seen for who I am and I am bringing certain value forward.
I can jump in next, but I also want to offer that other people can go too, so that it's not always like someone's time and gets like the cleanup, right? Does someone else want to go? All right, I'll just keep going then. For me, a lot of times, and I'm being completely transparent with the participants here, but a lot of times I'm mistaken for a man, and most of the time when using the restroom. So I'm a cis woman, identify as female, always have my entire life, use she, her pronouns my entire life, but often I'm mistaken for a man. And I think a lot of times, so for instance, I'll give you an example, playing co-ed slow pitch softball, and you have to bat man, woman, like that's one of the league rules. And a lot of times I'd come up to hit and they'd be like, wait, that's 3 guys in a row, right? Like, and I'm like, no, right? So I think for me, it shows up in that way. And I think part of why I mentioned in that first answer about how folks show up in spaces, I think is really important, because for me, I don't identify as non-binary, but I also think about all the non-binary folks out there who may have identity that's still related to being female or woman, because there's all kind, it runs the spectrum how folks might identify. So being able to see people for their authentic selves and allowing them to participate as they come, I think is really important. And so for me, I think that's the thing that comes to mind immediately. My parents named me Casey, which is could be man or woman name, right? So that certainly doesn't help. I think if I had a more feminine name, it wouldn't happen all the time, per se. Short hair, I like to wear bow ties. You can't see me other than sitting here, but I am not a small person. I'm 6 feet tall. So I'm not a dainty individual, if you will. So I'm happy to speak pretty regularly. So I think for me, what I've learned from that is I'm cautious. I pay attention to my surroundings, and I'm, again, being perfectly transparent. When I'm not on campus, because I feel very safe at WPI, that's not where I'm specifically talking about, but I don't tend to go to the restroom unless I'm with another person who very clearly is a woman. And I talk to them as we enter. So it's like, they know I'm supposed to be in this restroom. So that's how that shows up for me. Whoever wants to go next, that's the end of my story.
Just like, honestly, like for me, like I think it's really important to me that like I like, obviously when you see me, like you probably see like a woman of color, but also like I'm also seen as someone who is very educated, who comes from a higher socioeconomic background. And I think more than like being defined by all of these things that are typically like discriminated against or have bad perceptions, I am very well aware that like I get a lot of perceptions that really, really shelter a lot of the things that I would face if I came from, if I wasn't like educated or came from a lower socioeconomic background. And I think like when we're thinking about like our experiences and how we're defined by them, we often think about the things that we are defined by that are looked at as lower or looked at as different, especially in activist spaces. There's sometimes even a like privilege Olympics or oppression Olympics. And that's why like I really like when I'm asked this question, like I'm really lucky. I don't have like really scary stories. I've never been scared for my safety. I did grow up in Nebraska in a very white place that was scary at times, but at the end of the day, like I always felt pretty safe. And I think that has described a large part of my experience. But at the same time, like I am an Asian person who is looking into taking up a career in the entertainment industry, which is really, really terrible for Asian people, and always has been in ways that it's not, in ways that it's like differently terrible for like Asian people. And like as someone who wants to increase representation in that area, like I always feel a very, very large burden on my back, because if I make a wrong decision or say something wrong, like I will get blacklisted in Hollywood. Like that's just how it is. There's very few of us and everyone knows each other. And what my actions, like they affect everyone around me and everyone who looks like me and everyone who comes after me that even has like a little identity like me. And so I think like the defining of myself as someone who's not like represented in like careers and areas that I would like to take up, you know, space in, that like it creates a lot of like it creates a lot of anxiety and stress.
I think in terms of my experiences, I've definitely had like, I guess, a mixture of things, but I would say in particular, high school was really the time where I really faced a lot of discrimination, Islamophobia. I had the privilege of attending a predominantly white institution for a boarding school. And coming from my background and being surrounded, going to predominantly Black and Latinx schools and then making the transition to a school that was predominantly white was not easy at all. And I would constantly find myself having to speak up about my religion, my background, and educate people. And it's exhausting. So I think safety has never been something I've felt in this country, except for when I'm like at home. And I think that has a lot to do with Black Muslim women, but also talking about having to educate people about like my background can be extremely exhausting, like I said before. So I think it's always been a mixture for me. And I think that's why I've been dedicated to this cause and this movement, because of how much I've seen it play out and how much ignorance I've seen play out in my high school experience. So yeah, that's.
Thank you guys for being so honest. It's very interesting to like learn about all these perspectives. And the fourth question will be, in acknowledgement of Black History Month, how do you make your feminism anti-racist? If Casey, if you want to start.
Sure. So I think for me, it's an ever evolving, I guess, the learning experience is never over for me. I think in any of the intersectionalities that we're talking about here, but I think specifically in the areas of race. I am a white person. And for me, a lot of it is making sure that my Black and brown female counterparts are heard, and that I do everything I can in spaces I'm at work and in other places to make sure that I can say, hey, would you like to chime in? Or, hey, would you like to speak up? Because I think a lot of times the conversation is dominated by particularly white cis males, but even white cis females. And so how do we make sure that they're supported and heard? I also think giving credit where credit is due is really important. And so we know that this country in particular right now was basically like brought along on the backs of Black women, and making sure that that credit is given and not trying to pretend that it's something else. And so I think for me, we're trying to continue to remain educated, do a really good job of listening, do a really good job of supporting, and also providing space so that you can take a back seat and know when it's not your space and time to speak and allow others to have the floor. So that's my answer for me.
That's an awesome answer. Like, I believe that we all believe on that. Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things I focus on with my team within my company is something called authentic leadership through value-based inclusion, right? So if we think about it, we talk about a lot about inclusion, and especially when it comes to gender conversations as well, in racial conversations. Let's make sure everyone has a seat at the table. But it's not enough to stop there, because the question is everyone comfortable bringing their true self forward? And to be honest, the answer for most times, it's no. And it goes back to what was said earlier. It's not enough for us to look at things from like, an equity perspective and have a blanket solution and a blanket kind of assumption of what it means for people to have a seat at the table. The question is, how do we make sure, and this is something that we work with different companies and corporations and universities, is how do we make sure that every single person can bring their true, authentic self forward? Which means that through the lens of race and gender and disability and others, everyone has their complex background and experience and who they are. And we need to make sure that we actually use this concept, curiosity through the lens of compassion. I want to hear your story. I want to listen to who you are. I'm going to give you the space, and I'm not going to make assumptions of who you are. And when you approach every single person with that mentality, but also the mentality that that person has something beautiful to contribute, so a value-based inclusion perspective, you then give the floor and the space for everyone to really bring out more of their true self forward. So that's something that we're focusing on. That allows us to really tackle the conversations around race and gender and et cetera.
That's extremely powerful. Fatimata, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think when it comes to being anti-racist, a lot of people have this idea that it's just about making sure I have one Black person in the room. But they don't look at whether it's a light-skinned person or a dark-skinned person. A lot of times colorism is a huge issue and people think of racism as just it being a black and white issue when it's not. And I think I always push people, when you want to be anti-racist, you're going to look at colorism. You're going to look at socioeconomic status. You're going to look at so many different aspects because Black people aren't a monolith. And I think a lot of people treat Black people as a monolith in terms of trying to bring diversity into their spaces, in terms of having the conversation about racism. Black people are diverse. And I think when I always tell people about anti-racism, you're actively trying to combat not just racism, but colorism, prejudice, all these other things. And also, educating yourself is not enough. I think, where's your money going? Are you donating to mutual aid? Are you helping to uplift and build the Black community, and not just in the sense of at a conference, I bring a Black friend along, or in a room, I make sure I have a Black person in there, but are you actually contributing in a way that makes our community feel comfortable and safe and builds sustainability within it?
Last but not least, Ina, if you want to go ahead.
Tough to follow that up. But this question, like, I think often we ask like people, like, how are you, like, how do you try not to be racist? Or now it's like, how do you try not to be like anti-racist? And it's like, the thing with that question that is like really like hard for me to like articulate sometimes is that, like, I don't believe like I'm the one that gets to say I'm anti-racist. Like, I'm not the one that gets to say that. Like, I'm not anti-racist, and I am racist. That's just like, I am affected by all the ways that like the world has taught me to think. I grew up in, like, I grew up in an Indian family, and South Asia has a lot of, like, non-Black South Asians treat Black South Asians very badly. There's so many effects from like colonization, from white supremacy, all of those things, and they are like stuck in my mind, and I constantly have to decolonize my brain. And I think like I do make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes like every day in regards to this. And I think for me, it's just like having a commitment to not being fragile when my mistakes are pointed out, and owning them, and making sure that the people, or like doing my best to make sure people feel comfortable telling me when I make a mistake so that I can change it. And that really is what it is for me. But it's also like thinking about it in like every decision that I make, and like thinking about like, oh, like, where are my clothes coming from? Like, where's my food coming from? If I donate to this organization, like, who is it serving? Just like what Fatimata said about like where your money is going. And I think like for me, like I am a student, like I don't have a full-time job, but like whatever like money that I do make, like I have a commitment to like making sure that a good portion of it goes to like communities that and like organizations that support like Black people. And yeah, that's like really, I think it's just like a constant commitment, not only to educating myself, but like a constant commitment to making sure that I am owning up to my mistakes and trying to create a space where people can directly confront me about my mistakes.
Those are all amazing points. Now moving on to the fifth question is related to that. It's, what problems have you witnessed or faced that you would like to be more widely addressed by the feminism movement? Fatimata, if you would like to start.
I think a problem that I've witnessed a lot is revolving around my identity being Muslim and the hijab. I think a lot of feminists have this idea that women in the hijab are oppressed, and it's like not a lot of them are educated about the hijab and what it means and like the choice behind it. Feminism is giving women the right to choose. If it is, then don't push your ideologies onto like Muslim women who wear their hijab and just automatically assume that they're oppressed because of the scarf that they, because the hijab is about like the way we act. Even men also have to like wear hijab as well. So it's not just like a one-sided thing. It's more of a concept. And I think not just in media, but just in general, like women need to do a better job of like really deconstructing this mindset of like automatically assuming that women in hijab are oppressed. I think that's one big problem I've witnessed a lot. And I've multiple times have tried to have conversations revolving around it because I think it's really important. And I think in order to include more Muslim women within the feminist movement, that that's one way we can address that problem.
If you would like to go.
Yeah, I would say, okay, so okay, a lot of times I get a lot of heat for saying what I'm about to say, but I really do truly believe this is really important. The feminist movement, I think like over the past couple years has gotten better, like not good, I will not say good, but better at focusing on people who aren't cis women and like non-binary folks and trans people. But I really do think the feminist movement needs to do a better job at focusing how like the patriarchy affects cis men, because it really does affect cis men, and it does a lot. We often don't think about how mass incarceration is not just a racial issue, it is a gender issue. We don't think about that most violence in the United States and the world is caused by men. And it's not a biology thing, it's because they are taught that violence is the only way that they can show their emotions. They are taught that violence is the only correct way to do anything. And like boys aren't born like this, they're trained to be that way, which is why it's so important that we go in at a young age and we teach boys like that it is okay to show your emotions, it is okay to be feminine, right? Like we have to really do that. And the patriarchy and gender perceptions, it's killing not only women, non-binary people, and trans people, it's killing all of those people at an alarming high rate, way more than it's killing cis men. But the truth is killing cis men. The like majority of suicides are cis men, and 70% of like male suicides are middle-aged white men. There is a reason for that. It's not just a coincidence. It's because of the way that men are taught to talk about their emotions, talk about getting help, and all of those things. And I think like we often like forget that like, yes, the feminism movement needs to always focus on the people that are the most oppressed. But if we don't talk to the people that are in decision-making power, if we don't teach people who do make up 50% of our population what the right way is to act, what is the okay way to act, we aren't going to see progress. And so like that, I really do believe that we need to focus on that and how the patriarchy is literally killing men.
Thank you for mentioning that. Like no one ever mentions the men's side because we're never really like focusing on that part. But Casey, would you like to go?
Sure. So I think that's actually a pretty good segue probably for what I was going to say. But I think also I'm like a broken record, but I think within the feminist movement, I think also looking at the whole scope of individuals that might fall under that category. And I think men are included in that, as Ina just pointed out. But I think making sure that, you know, much like we were talking about related to colorism, like not assuming that every one woman is created equal, and or trans women and or binary folks, non-binary folks, making sure that the expectation is not what we traditionally think of when we think of a woman, right? And whether, no matter what that identity is or what that looks like, making sure that that's included. Because often when we talk about gender equality and some of the things we're looking at in that space, we're really talking about gender equality compared to the white cis men, and not just gender equality as a blanket statement. So I think really trying to think about how all of that shows up. I think for me too, it's also making sure that everyone feels safe to be themselves in those spaces and having those conversations. I think this has already been talked about a little bit, but you know, and again, I'm being super transparent with you all. It took me a very long time to feel comfortable wearing bow ties to work. I really like wearing a bow tie. I actually feel more professional when I go to work wearing a bow tie than when I don't. But it took me a really long time feeling comfortable with that. And I don't think it was because I didn't want to wear the bow tie. I just think it's because of the way in which people expect a woman to be at work, what a woman's expected to wear, and some of those things that you're taught sort of early on. And so really challenging what it is to be professional. And when someone says, well, you need to be professional, well, what does that mean? Because I certainly would say me wearing a shirt and bow tie and a suit jacket to the office, I'm dressed professionally, right? So really trying to challenge some of those stereotypes across any type of stereotype related to dress. But I think that's another really big piece for me.
Amazing. So for me, I think a topic, a theme that I feel like is not covered or discussed as much as it should be within the feminist movement is disability. Let me give you guys a perspective. So 1/7 of the world's population, 1 billion, are people with disabilities, okay? And around in the developing countries, only 1 to 2% of girls are literate. So the access to education for girls with disabilities is very low. So, and this is a really, really big issue, because I've been in a lot of conversations when it's discussing gender and education, gender and employment, and so many different things, and disability is never really brought forward, even though it's impacting all of us in different ways. And if it is, then maybe it's brought forward in a very much either a charity lens or even a human rights lens, right? Like, okay, I guess we have to really educate girls with disabilities. But we need to come to a point where we really approach it from a value-based lens. We as society, we need to include girls with disabilities in our schools, in our system, because we will lose out on their value if we don't. And I remember this example. One time I met this woman, and she was building a school for girls and in some country. I'm not gonna mention the country, but I asked her, I was like, well, are you gonna include and integrate girls with disabilities? And she's like, not now. Let's just first make sure we get the normal kids, or the kids, the normal kids first, and then we'll think about disability afterwards when we have the financial resources. It shouldn't be that girls with disabilities are an add-on. It should be part of the system from the get-go. We need to see as girls with disabilities as part of our system. So that is something that I would love for to be discussed more and more and more in our society when we're talking about education for girls.
Amazing.
Can I add one thing to that? Because I think it's super important. So I do a lot of work specifically on our campus around physical space and universal design, and it goes to the disability piece that Sarah's talking about. For those that don't know, universal design in terms of physical space is making spaces so that all individuals, regardless of ability, can participate fully without needing to have a separate entrance or a different way of getting in, and everyone can sort of be together and go together. And I think a really huge piece for me in terms of all of these pieces we're talking about around intersectionality is physical space. And what does that physical space look like? What is that physical space decorated with? How do you get to that physical space? So is the universal design piece. But I think that's a really important part of what we're talking about related to intersectionality. And it's something that in my role, I try to focus on a lot to make sure that as we update physical spaces, we're focused on accessibility. We're also focused on what is the decor, who is it welcoming to, and making sure that that eye to who it's welcoming to is looking at a broader picture and not just like sort of the same old, and what you would picture on a college campus. So sorry to go on a little soapbox, but I think it's important to bring up, because I think for anyone, if you think about your physical space and where you're comfortable in your homes, wherever, that's what you have to try to replicate in public spaces for all people to feel like they are a part of that space and are welcome in that space. So I apologize, a little soapbox on that, but
I love it.
Definitely don't apologize. That was amazing. Thank you. So the next question is, with all of your amazing ideas, what do you guys plan to do, and what have you already done in the community to make feminism more intersectional? If Fatimata, if you want to start, and we could just go from that.
Yes, most definitely. So my community constantly changes, like because of location, college, high school, everything. But in terms of my college career so far, I started the Dear Lafayette Coalition along with an upperclassman to combat the issues that BIPOC students were facing on campus. And a big thing that we've included in our demands that have been ongoing with our administration is including our broader community, which is the Easton town. And there's a large issue of Black women who have been incarcerated and not really given the proper resources. And in terms of students on our campus, not really educated about the broader community. People don't really contribute to the broader community because we're on a hill and like we don't have to worry about how we impact people outside the hill, as they like to say. But we've really been working with administration to create funding. And we also started the Lafayette Mutual Aid, which we've raised, I think, $6,000 this past week. And that's going out to people within the Easton community. I'm also working on getting a community fridge up, hopefully, to help provide resources for women in the Easton community as well, but also like people in general. So I've been actively working on my campus to try and find ways to really make the community better and also have further conversations with women of different backgrounds and identities.
That's so cool. Okay, Ina, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think like, sorry, excuse me, I have such bad allergy. I've been coughing all the time. Like I just kind of like have a commitment to making sure that like the spaces that I'm in and like the movements that I lead and like both my nonprofits are doing everything that like they can to be intersectional. And like when I founded Dream Equal, like one of the things that was the most important thing for me was that it did focus on all genders and not just cis females, that it did that it was community led and that I wasn't the one that was telling people how to act or telling people like this is how you solve gender equality, but like making sure that we only go into spaces that are led by people who are actually lived and grew up and experienced those spaces, and just like constantly like spreading that message and constantly questioning every time that like I do implement like something as a part of my nonprofit, or every time I do make a decision. There's obviously like countless different questions that you have to ask, but I always ask three that are really important to me. It's like, oh, like how does gender affect this? How is the climate affected by this? And how are people of different races affected by this? And like I look into them and I think about it. And even just like in small things, I think it's people often underestimate the power of just conversation and the power of awareness. Awareness and conversation is not everything. It's not going to solve everything, but that is the first step. And like even in class, like in school, like I always make sure that like I kind of have like a thing going where like I have to make sure that I bring in the climate or gender stereotypes in every conversation. I took a class on mass incarceration. All three of my essays were about like gender stereotypes. Like it just kind of like making sure that everything that I'm learning, I'm connecting it to the people that are affected by it the most, and also like acknowledging that I am not perfect at it and I'm nowhere close to even good at it. And so like, yeah, I think just spreading the knowledge about like how to be on that journey in a healthy way.
That's amazing to always have like a mindset to knowledge. Casey, what about you working at a school?
So I think that mindset to knowledge never ends. I'm jealous that some of our panelists are still in college. I'm not. I just work at one. But I think that mindset is really important no matter what industry you go into, and to not ever think like you're an expert in specifically in these areas of diversity, social justice, inclusion, equity, feminism, any of them, and always being willing to learn. I think it was touched on earlier too, but also always being aware of your own biases, right? We all have them, and to act as if we don't is just foolish. And so being aware of them and being able to check them, being able to question, am I reacting this way because of X, or am I really reacting this way because it's legitimate and I should react this way, right? So being aware of those things, self-aware, I think is really important. One of the things that I'm really proud of that we've done is created a leadership program for student leaders to be able to learn about their own identities and how those identities show up in spaces when they're interacting with their peers on our campus. We call it LEAD. And so I think I'm really proud of that from the angle of really diving in on what your identity is, how you identify as an individual, both from social identities, but also just your upbringing and your background. And so that's something that I'm really proud of, and I'm hopeful that we will continue to do. The thing I would add to that though is we've changed the curriculum for that program. It's been around for about 4 or 5 years now. We've changed the curriculum because it's back to that, like the learning is never over. And if we left that curriculum stagnant and the same, it's not changing with the world around us. And so I think just having that commitment is really important to me. The other thing I will just add briefly, because we haven't really talked about this at all, is pronoun use. I think I am very excited to just hear the board and the folks that organized this panel using pronouns like it's nothing. I think that for me, over the course of my career, the use of pronouns has been more and more used, introducing yourself with them, having them on your name tag, even if you're cis. And I think it's taken a lot of education. And actually, I think that's how Olivia met me in the first place, was doing a training around pronouns and preferred names. And I think just those pieces are really important as well, so that everyone feels included, regardless of how they identify. Because I think a lot of times we get caught on this, there's only 2 choices to that answer, and we know there's not. But so how do we continue to educate others on why using pronouns and not assuming pronouns is really important?
Thank you, Casey, for that response. Sarah, if you would like to go.
Yeah, definitely. It's beautiful what everyone's doing, and I want to build up a little bit about the bias and ism. So one of the things that within my company that we do is these really unique trainings called In the Dark, where we remove the lens of sight to have greater vision. So imagine you're put in a space and you're meeting a person for the first time without being able to see them. And on top of it, actually, we tell them you cannot say your name, where you're from, what work you do, and your educational background. So removing additional labels. So you're really put in a space where this constraint of not seeing gives you the freedom of actually seeing that person for who they are, because you're not able to make a lot of assumptions. And on the other hand, because you cannot be seen and there aren't any assumptions towards you, you actually become more free to be yourself, right? It goes back to this whole concept of authenticity. So we do these workshops in so many different spaces across the world. And the whole point is actually to get people to really start reflecting and realizing how do these narratives of isms impact how I see myself, and how have I been contributing to these narratives and isms. And one of the main kind of topics and focuses that we actually bring forward in these workshops is the gender conversation. And we always have women speak up in those sessions saying, I am more comfortable as a woman to speak up, speak my mind in this setting, in this blindfolded or setting, than in the normal setting. Which is very powerful, but which is really sad, right? It's like we still have so much work to be done where we're removing these isms. But I guess what was said before, it's both we are part of creating these narratives, and also these narratives have impacted us, right? So that's kind of what we've been trying to do, bring forward. And again, by the end of the workshop, we're not telling you, hey guys, we're not saying let's be blind. No, we want people to see one another. We want people to see the beauty of each other. but we want to make sure that we're recognizing and delaying our assumptions and actually seeing one another through this one assumption that this person has something beautiful to contribute, and let's not make any other assumption. So that's how we're kind of contributing to the feminism conversation.
That's amazing. I would definitely want to join one of those like dark thingies. It's so cool. So we have one last question for today, and it is, what are your hopes for the feminist movement in the future, and what can the young activists and the people on the Zoom today make it become a reality? Fatimata, if you would like to start.
Oh, that's a tough question. I guess what I hope for in the future is basically like people really doing a lot of unlearning within themselves. I always tell people like you have to start inward. And I think once we all start inward and really go through unlearning a lot of the biases, and language is a huge thing. I forgot to talk about this, but how we communicate with one another has been deeply constructed by the society we live in, the words we use, like how we're taught to communicate with one another. So I really hope for the feminist movement in the future is for people to do a lot of unlearning to lead to progression. And I think for the people out there, how we can work towards that is, like I said, start inward, but also start in your community. I think a lot of people underestimate the power of local organizing and actually connecting with the people around you first before trying to do some big scale thing, because that's like where your foundation is, and that's where you really learn about these biases and prejudices you may have gathered along the way. And it's also where you learn more about humanity and what people actually need. So yeah.
Thank you for the response. Ina, if you would like to go next.
Yeah, I think my hopes for the feminist movement changes a lot as I learn more about gender equality and what that truly is. But I think just like as we've seen, like the progress that we have had around the years, like from first wave to second wave to third wave to fourth wave feminism, I just hope that like in the future we can continue to learn and grow and change the way that we look at feminism, or change the way that we look at gender equality as we gain more knowledge as to what that is, and as we learn more about people, and as we learn more about gender equality. And I think in terms of like what young activists can do to make that a reality, I always like, people always ask me like, oh, like how can I be an activist, blah 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 blah, and it's like you already are. I truly believe that like the biggest way of like being an activist is being yourself in a world that doesn't want you to. And I think like that is the biggest form of activism. It truly is. It's hard and it sucks that like we have to do it, but just not being willing to put yourself in a box and constantly just making sure that you are just staying like true to yourself without letting like what other people say like affect you, which is really hard. And I think that is being yourself is your biggest form of activism. I really think that.
My next.
Yeah, sorry.
So I think definitely being yourself is the biggest form of activism, but I also think understanding that representation matters. And so if we're thinking about sort of all the waves of feminism that we've seen, I think, if you are comfortable being you and showing up as yourself, and representing sort of that segment of the population, as small a sliver as it might be to the largest sliver that it might be, that next wave of individuals after you are going to feel like they've got someone that represents them and they see themselves in. And that's like, I can't impress upon folks enough how important that is. So if you're someone out there, young person on this Zoom or watching the recording, and you like wearing bow ties, like I'm much older than you, here I am wearing bow ties. Like I think it's just, that's really important, and that can't be emphasized enough. And so I think for me, the continuation of that feminist movement is, I think, as talked about, how do we really define gender and gender equality, but also how do we continue to have representation across the entire spectrum of femininity and woman and all different types of gender identities, so that everyone feels included in that conversation. that to me, I think, is what I'm hopeful for moving forward. And the only other thing I'll add to that is I think the word feminism has also, in terms of definition, has changed dramatically in the last, let's say, like 50 years. And I think it will continue to change, and that's not a bad thing. And so I think embracing that change and continuing to remain educated on what the different topics and important pieces to take up are is also crucial.
Amazing. I love what everyone has been saying, and I guess what I would love to say and just is a couple things. One is there's so much power within us, as you know, in this feminist move. There's so much power within us, and there's power within every single one of us to really make a difference in our lives and the lives of others, right? And I think really truly believing that within ourselves is the first step. And then I think also creating room and reflection to really take a step back and think about, you know, am I bringing my true self forward, as I was said before? If not, why not? And how can I be there for others to bring their true self forward? And I think that's the important part too. We have the power to empower others. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think, you know, again, curiosity through a lens of compassion is what's really important for us to really embody as we're moving towards that. I just love seeing him across the globe, you know, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's this amazing young woman that, you know, is such a great leader, right? Or within Finland, or, you know, we are getting there in the US, you know, our first vice president of a woman of color. So I think there's hope and there's power, and I think let's really move forward in empowering ourselves and empowering one another.
Thank you guys all so much for coming today. I love all your ideas, and I believe inspired all of us. So we will be moving on back to the slide, and Orly will start.